Hi, my name's Sam George, and I'm going to be reading from my latest book, Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. I'm going to be reading from the chapter about my mother. It's titled Marianne. And I'm going to be reading sort of the end of that story that connects with of course, to the beginning of that story that starts out. When I was 12 years old, I didn't know my mother was an alcoholic. I thought she was insane. Because when you think about it, at 12 years old, if you had no idea that your mother was an alcoholic, how would you explain to yourself, how would you rationalize the mood swings, the behavior changes, all the things that go with, with the personality changes when somebody's a drinker like that. And I address, I guess what you say, a certain amount of trauma when I was younger, is that because of an acrimonious divorce agreement, we used to have to travel back from Hawaii to Ohio, where my mother was living, during the summers. And in the afternoon and evenings, after a day of drinking, she would take us for a drive in her car to go visit my dad's relatives who also lived in that town. And, to my 12-year-old sensibilities, I actually thought that my mother's drunken driving, those were attempts to kill us, to kill my brother, Matt, and my sister Julie and I. And that every time we drove in that car, we were rolling the dice. And it was a very traumatic thing to think, about your mother. And so at the end of that story is where I'm going to take up this reading right now. And I write, I saw very little of my mother throughout the decades that followed, an estrangement that I resolutely maintained for almost 25 years. Maybe it was the vestigial fear lurking behind the wall I built in my heart, having once actually believed that my mom was trying to kill me. That kind of thing could stick with a kid. Or maybe simply an irreversible loss of trust. Regardless, I chose to live my life without her, thus consigning my mother, steeped in despair, to live hers without me, without her eldest son. She died on January 9th, 1993, having never seen me surf. On that same day, I was in Spain's Basque Country, riding spectacular waves at Mundaka, one of the world's premier surf spots, sharing the eerily empty lineup with longtime friend Tommy Curran. News of my mother's death didn't reach me until later that evening, after we'd driven back north across the border into France, and then on to Tommy's adopted home in Signos, a quiet commune in the Côte Sud's Nouvelle-Aquitaine region. Word had come from Julie, and could I somehow get back to Chillicothe, Ohio, where Marianne had been living with her husband Jack, as soon as possible. It would have to be the 7:21 a.m. high-speed TGV train from Gare de Bayonne to Paris. Surfboards would need to be packed, last-minute bereavement flights arranged. But before all that, I pulled on a heavy sweater and stepped out into the chilly French night, a waxing gibbous moon casting the dormant vineyard adjacent to Tommy's villa in a funereal silver shadowy light. Head down, hands in pockets, I walked deeper into the farmland on a lumpy dirt track, pursued by memories. Europe again, 1963. We were in Italy, taking the train home from Naples, where we'd been visiting my dad during a few days of his leave from shipboard duties. Mom, Julie, Matt, and I on our way back to France, back to school in Cannes. We had a transfer to make at Ca de Bicchetti, a small station on the rail line connecting the port city of La Spezia with points north and west. We were in no hurry. You can't be when traveling by train. Yet the station's ornate platform clock was no friend. Dad had arranged with a couple of naval ensigns on a fleet ship laying over in La Spezia to meet us at the train station with a half-dozen lunch boxes packed with the American food us kids had been craving. PB&J sandwiches on white Wonder Bread, Lay's potato chips, and chocolate chip cookies. But the sailors were overdue, and the kindly conductor, after checking his vest watch for the third time, extended his arms with palms upright in the classic Neapolitan "what can I do" gesture, insisting that the family board the waiting train. Julie, Matt went first, helped up into the rear carriage platform by the conductor, followed by my mother. I was next, when suddenly we heard the screech of tires. Here were the sailors, their jeep piled with pink pastry boxes tied with string, our PB&Js. The two sailors, each balancing a stack of boxes, rushed to the back of the train, handing them up to my mom. As they did this, the train began to slowly pull away from the station. But I wasn't on it. I dashed back to the jeep to retrieve a remaining box. My mother, the sailors, the conductor, all yelling at me to leave the food for God's sake and hurry back to the train. This I did, running as fast as a small for his age 6-year-old could over the awkwardly spaced railroad ties. The train, however, was picking up speed, and I had to press hard to reach where both my mother and the conductor leaned out over the rear carriage's back railing, arms outstretched. It was the dapper little man who caught me by the wrist and swung me up onto the train, expressively admonishing me in voluble Italian. My mom simply brushed the hair out of my face and led me into the rail car, where Julie and Matt were already taking advantage of the U.S. Navy's thoughtfully provided booty. 53 days before my mother died, I made one of the rare visits to Ohio and found myself back in a car with her, but with me behind the wheel this time, taking her out for a late lunch at her favorite A&W diner. She seemed so tiny, so frail sitting next to me, on oxygen by this point, the nasal cannula running back to the portable tank we'd stashed in the wheel well behind the driver's seat. Not wanting to tax her breathing, I did most of the talking, the sort of superficial recital of events characteristic of long-absent sons, as if a yawning chasm, years wide, could be bridged with the trivial details of my daily life. But on the way back to her apartment, after she'd finished her chili dog, after the longest silence we'd experienced thus far, it struck me that this could be the very last time that I'd ever see my mother, and perhaps the last opportunity to ask her a question that had long been on my mind. "Mom," I said, "remember that time in Italy at the little train station, waiting for our box lunches from Dad's ship?" "Cada Bocchetti," she said, unclipping the cannula so she could speak more easily. "Of course I do." Of course she did. I pressed on. Thinking back on it, I've always wondered, what would you have done if I hadn't have caught up to the train? Without a moment's hesitation, she said, "I would have jumped off." "Seriously?" I asked. "Of course," she said, an echo of pride, of defiance still discernible in her smoke-ravaged voice. "You'd have abandoned Julie and Matt? For me?" I would have trusted that the conductor, who was so very nice, would certainly have taken them off at the next stop and have someone sit with them until you and I caught up on the next scheduled train. I would have never left you. Ever since those distant days riding around Newark in my mother's Mustang, with my nose pressed up against Surfer magazine, I'd let my mother's affliction define her, to define every margin of our relationship throughout the decades. The son of an alcoholic, I found it easier to maintain that masked identity than to let down my guard and appreciate who she was at her essence. To do that would mean missing her. Missing the mother who so profoundly shaped my young life in the years before her fall into the alcoholic's abyss. A talented East Haven High School varsity swimmer in her youth, she taught me to swim when I was 3 years old, standing with me the very first time I tasted salt water at Thomas Point Beach near our home in Brunswick, Maine, sharing her lifelong love of the water. A creative and popular elementary school teacher, she encouraged me to read outside the bounds of the 3rd and 4th grade curriculums, Robert McCluskey's Time of Wonder and The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. A writer of crisp prose and visually evocative poetry, she listened patiently to all my extravagant schoolboy stories, saying always, "You should write that down." Now standing there in the moonlight among the withered vines on a cold, still night in France, I missed my mother, Mary Ann. But this feeling was followed almost immediately by an even more stark realization, seeping into my heart like a deep chill. I had never once in my entire adult life jumped off the train for her. And I remember thinking in that moment that I'd regret that fact for the rest of my life. And I was right.